Hi everyone, Michael P. Spradlin back today with Chapter 2 of The Enemy Above. I am reading along with lots of other authors all around the globe under the hashtag Authors Take Action, sharing our books, sharing our stories, hopefully giving some distraction and relief from all the craziness that's going on out there. Here in Michigan, our stay-at-home order was just extended by the governor. And I know it's getting tough, and I know that kids miss a lot of school. I feel bad for the senior classes this year that are missing so many of their milestone moments. But we have to remember that this is all for the best for us. And the best that we can do is to stay home, follow the social distancing guidelines, and remember when we are out and about that everyone is working under enormous amounts of stress. So let's be kind to each other, all right? So today we will pick up with Chapter 2 of The Enemy Above. Chapter 2. Major Karl von Dusen stood in the back of the half-track, scanning the horizon with his binoculars. The darkness and the vehicle's rough, jostling ride made it difficult to see anything. If he spotted any type of movement, he would order the driver to stop. Then he could focus the lenses on whatever was running. That is what the Jews were doing, running. And those who had chosen not to run, those who thought they could stand against the might of the Third Reich, they were no longer a problem. Major von Dusen smiled. It had been a glorious day. His mission had been so successful, he wondered if he would become the youngest lieutenant colonel in the Gestapo. As the terrain grew more uneven, the half-track's front tires rolled over every stone, and its back treads bounced across every bump. Von Dusen dropped the binoculars and let them hang around his neck. He had volunteered to take a small unit to do some reconnaissance. Many of the Jews in the area had waited until the last moment, believing the blitzkrieg would fail, that somehow pitiful Polish resistance fighters could oppose or halt the greatest army in the world. Now they were running, and that made them careless, easy to catch. Still, the Germans were vulnerable. The Russian army, still far to the east, but partisan forces and militias ran wild through the countryside. The militias were dangerous. They were composed of reserve soldiers from the Russian army who were older or perhaps too sick to fight, but they had weapons and they were organized. The partisan fighters were less of a threat to the German forces. They were mostly civilians who opposed the current Ukrainian government for cooperating with the Reich. A bunch of university students and poets, self-described intellectuals who ran around the countryside pretending to be soldiers. Karl von Dusen did not fear them, but he would remain vigilant. Even bookworms could stage an ambush. The headlights of the hash-track cut sharply through the gloom. It was a cloudy, moonless night. But they had passed an empty farmhouse a few kilometers back. It had belonged to Jews, but now it was deserted. And tellingly, the mezuzah was gone. A mezuzah was a small container that observant Jews attached to the doorpost of their homes, containing special verses from the Torah written on parchment. But at this house, the mezuzah had been removed. Von Dusen knew that meant the occupants did not intend to return anytime soon. Yet the ashes in the fireplace had still been glowing, and the wood stove was warm. Whoever lived in the house had fled only recently, which meant that more than likely they were still nearby, and Major von Dusen would find them. Up ahead, two dirt roads crossed each other. A flash of movement in the wheat field near the intersection caught the Major's eye. He tapped the driver on the shoulder. "Halten," he said. The driver hit the brake. "Engine," he commanded. The driver turned the vehicle off. When the motor sputtered to a stop, von Dusen listened carefully. He heard nothing, so he waited. There was no chirp of insects or call of night birds. Perhaps the noise of the half-track had scared them away. And if the rustling he'd seen wasn't coming from animals, it could only mean one thing. Someone was nearby. "Arms," he said. His driver and the other two men he brought with him took up their rifles and exited the vehicle. Von Dusen removed the Luger pistol from the holster at his belt. "Fan out." He and his sergeant, a man named Eberhardt, took the right side of the half-track, and the driver and another private took the left. Slowly they crept forward, stepping lightly and listening for anything that sounded out of place. Von Deusen's pulse quickened and he tried to slow his breathing. There was someone close by. He was sure of it. "Forward," he whispered. The four of them moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. He flicked on his flashlight. They walked along the road until they reached the place where he thought he'd seen something move. "Here," he whispered. He shone his light on the wheat field and spotted several crushed stalks, bent as though someone had recently tread on them as they passed through. "Form up," he said. The four men made a line along the road facing the field. With hand signals, Major Von Deusen motioned them forward. He kept the Luger pointed straight in front of him. They entered the field single file, the others switching on their flashlights. Von Deusen was sure someone was close by. He could feel it. He wished he had brought a dog with him. The dogs were exceptional at tracking runners. Cautiously, the men inched forward. Von Deusen swept the ground ahead of him with his flashlight. He was not afraid of the Jews. They did not fight back. But if resistance or militia fighters were nearby, the German lights could give them away. "Watch the tree line," he ordered. "If you see anything moving, shoot." He followed the tramp-down trail through the wheat field. Someone had definitely come through here. But by the time they had almost reached the tree line, they had yet to spot anyone cowering in the field. Perhaps the runners had rushed across the field earlier and were long gone. No, he was sure of it. Someone was close by. He could sense their fear. "If you are here," he called loudly, "you must show yourself. I promise you will not be harmed." There was no reply. "Spread out," he said quietly. The men widened the gap between them. Von Deusen waved them forward, and they crept along, listening for their prey, but they heard nothing. Suddenly, Von Deusen thought he heard what sounded like a human gasping for breath up ahead. He held up his hand, and his men stopped instantly. Were his ears playing tricks on him? No, he was certain he had heard something. A noise that did not belong in a wheat field in the middle of nowhere. Slowly, he snuck forward, his pistol raised. He swept the gun back and forth in front of him. They were about 25 meters from the tree line. He carefully examined the ground, expecting to discover a group of terrified Jews huddled together, cowering in fear. But he saw nothing. Where had they gone? The Germans were now at the tree line. He glanced behind him. Had they missed these mystery Jews somehow? Unlikely. He turned his attention to the forest ahead and considered his options. There were many more places to hide in the woods. He should have brought along dogs. "Mein Major?" Sergeant had asked. He was waiting for orders. Major Von Deusen holstered his Luger. "We will return to camp. Tomorrow, when we have the light on our side, we will come back and pick up the trail," he said. The four men returned to their half-track and turned it back toward the east. It zoomed away in the night. And that's the end of Chapter 2, and we'll be back tomorrow with Chapter 3. Everyone be safe.